we were scraping the mud off the walkways. It was cold. I only had wooden shoes, so that my earlobes froze, my toes froze. It was absolutely horrible. After the scraping of the mud in the afternoon, we were lined up to be deloused and go through the bathhouse. As we entered the bathhouse and undressed, I noticed that in that dressing room there was a young lady lying on a bench, a dead one, and I couldn't figure out what a dead corpse was doing there. So I asked one of the inmates working there what this dead corpse was doing there. He told me, "You guys are lucky that you came here at this time, because until now, Commander Hauptsturmführer Goethe, the commander of the camp, was shooting people at will, like on a duck hunt. He would ride his horse around the camp, stop at a place, walk in with his revolver and just shoot people at random. But now, about mid-January, Kraków-Płaszów was declared a concentration camp. Now, any execution had to be reported to Berlin, and they were not apparently allowed to bury the corpse until they got a response from Berlin. And this woman had apparently died, and she was lying there until the report was made out and sent to Berlin and responded to. Well, anyway, we went into the showers, washed, and were then assigned to barracks. My father, I, and my relative Moshe Heller, the man whose wife and the two babies were killed, and who had worked in our shop in our hometown, were sent to Barrack 29. And there we were just lying next to one another. It was awful, no comparison to what we had at the airbase. The following morning, around 5 o'clock, there was on the Appellplatz, which is the collection plaza, we were lined up there. First we were lined up alongside the barrack, where the barrack elder, Mr. Engelberg, was counting us to make sure that he had the full contingent there, because as we got to the Appellplatz and lined up in rows of 5, we were counted again and recounted, and the assessment in charge of that and a few other barracks was recounting again. If the count was not accurate, the barrack elder was responsible for it and was punished. So we were counted and recounted. Then we were assigned to our work. My father, I, and Moshe Heller were assigned to the glazier and painter shop. So we were sent in there. The Jews that were there already working resented us for the very simple reason that prior to our assignment there, some of the prisoners that were working there were taken out and shipped to somewhere else. And the paint and glazier shop was considered a sort of a recreation barrack. It was by no means recreation to me, but apparently it was better than being assigned to other work groups. But after a while, we came to know the people working there, and we got along quite well. We didn't have much work to do, so what we did is just sit there. By the time lunchtime came up, we had to go and pick up our contingent of food in the kitchen and brought it to the shop where it was distributed to each one of us. Not very much to eat. Now there was a gentleman there amongst the glaziers and painters by the name of Farber, and he apparently was an uncle of this Farber, the one who hit me, and who was the deputy head of the camp to Hilovich. Of course, he did not partake in the ration that was given to us. He went to the kitchen and through the back door got his own ration from the cook, where he was dished out from the bottom, where there was occasionally a piece of horse meat, and the barley was thicker than what we got. We got the water. So there were privileged people in the camp who were relatives of the couples. Anyway, we stayed there in that glazing and painting department. And one day, my father and I were assigned to glaze in the outer perimeter of the camp, where there were stables and where the Ukrainian SS were located. As we were working there, all of a sudden, a Ukrainian guard in a barrack across had shown me through the window a small loaf of bread. Probably he wanted to sell it to me or give it to me. So I walked out of the barrack we worked at and crossed over to his barrack. As I was going in there, an assessman, which was nicknamed Niedźwiedź, which in Polish means the bear, because he was a husky big guy, walked like a bear. The Niedźwiedź saw me go in there. When the Ukrainian noticed that, and I entered his barrack, he told me to go and hide under his bunk bed. Well, anyway, I did so. I crawled under that Ukrainian's bunk bed when all of a sudden the bear came in. Of course, he couldn't avoid seeing me under his bunk. So he pulls out his revolver and he tells me to stick out my head. Well, I thought that was the end. My mind, I was only concerned with my father. He will be left completely alone. I was not concerned with my dying. I hope he will kill me with a single shot into my head. As I stuck my head out, he said, schade die Kugel. That means I don't want to waste a bullet on you. And he told me to crawl out from under there. I did. He took me in to a different room, an empty room, and he told me to undress naked. I did so. I am dressed naked. He then took my striped blouse and he started feeling up along the collar. He had had experience, apparently, where people had sewn in some money into the collar. So he immediately started feeling up that collar and he felt something in there. So he took his bayonet out, stripped it open, and there was a $5 bill and 2 single dollars that I had sewn in there. He took the money, put it in his pocket, and now he said, tomorrow morning you are going to hang on the Appellplatz. On the Appellplatz there was always a hanging place, and every so often some prisoners were hung there, and the entire contingent of the prisoners had to march by and look at it. Well, there was nothing I could do. He wrote down my prisoner number into his little notebook, and he said, tomorrow you will hang. Then he took his whip and started hitting me with his whip. I kept running from one corner of the room to the next. And he after me with the whip, and after me. Well, he did that until he got short of breath. He started huffing and puffing when he stopped. I was still very well preserved because I had been at the air base where I did not suffer any significant hunger. So I could take his whipping, but he was short of breath. When he stopped, he had me dress and took me to a well, an old well where you used to pull up a bucket or lower it into the well for water. And he told me that he's going to chain me to that chain at the well, and he was going to lower me down into the well. Right there, a few Nazi children were playing around there, and they came by. So now he did not do it, and he let me go. When I went back to the barrack, my father had apparently seen all this through the window. And he was as white as a sheet. And of course, I was extremely shaky. My father took out a bottle of schnapps. It was actually Kümmel schnapps, and gave it to me. And I said, where did you take this? He said, one other assessment of higher rank, actually at the rank of a sergeant, gave it to him, and he told him, I saw what happened to your son, please give this to him. Now mind you, what a shock that was, an assessment in a concentration camp, having seen what happened to me, gave me the bottle of schnapps. So there was a spark of goodness, and just even on a rare occasion in an assessment. If you had seen the movie Schindler's List, you may have seen the scene where a young fellow was cleaning the bathtub of the commandant of Ghet. And apparently he didn't do a perfect job. So Ghet took his carabine and was going to shoot the kid. Schindler was around there, and Schindler told Ghet, whose buddy he was, what do you want from this little youngster? Why do you want to kill him? So you put away the gun. When Schindler left, He went out to the balcony as the kid was leaving and shot him from a distance. So what I thought, now here's a man whose spark of compassion lasted only a few seconds and it evaporated. Anyway, I did not tell my father about him telling me that I'll be hanging tomorrow and having written down my number, because I didn't want to worry him. But the following morning, I was only hoping that the bear will keep the $7 and will not report me. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. I found out from other prisoners that this particular SS man was searching incoming prisoners who had worked on the outside and who had smuggled in a few eggs or some bread that they got from Polish co-workers there. He took it away from them and he was selling it to other prisoners. And indeed, my relative Moshe Heller, that was with us, later was buying eggs from him, from that very same SS man. In mid-May of 1944, in Krakow, Płaszów, a naked parade took place. Naked parade was referred to undressing on the Appellplatz naked and walking by the SS doctor who sat at a table, and as you walked by was pointing one to the left, one to the right. It was obvious that the perfectly healthy ones were pointed to one side, and the not perfectly healthy were pointed to the other side. My father was 52 years old, and he was healthy, but he was very thin. But he was always thin and had sunken cheeks. He was pointed to the wrong side. Moshe Heller was pointed to the same side as my father. Moshe was only in his 30s, was a healthy man, but he had a low back, mild problem, so he walked a little bit off. And that was enough to point him to the other side. There was a painter with us, also in the 30s, perfectly healthy, but he had psoriasis of the skin, a benign condition of the skin. And when that SS doctor, Blanker was his name, saw him, he pointed him also in the direction of the doomed, which it appeared to be. There was a girl that was pregnant. She was from my hometown. She was pointed also in the direction of the doomed. Anyway, about a week later, all these people who were pointed to the wrong side were called out during the appel in the morning and were taken away and shipped off to Auschwitz for gassing. As my father left me, he was trying to give me his little piece of bread that he had in his pocket. And I, not wanting to take possibly a ray of hope away from him, told him that he should take it because he will need it more than I, since I was staying in Krakow, Płaszów. Then he gave me a $20 gold coin that he had with him. And I was pushing it back to him, but he was pushing it back to me, and I took it. As he walked away, he told me, since you are the only one thus far that has survived, and he said, I know where I'm going, and I don't care anymore to live, because if I live another 10 years, I will eat another ton of potatoes. Life is meaningless to me now that I lost everybody. And I hope that you will survive the war, and if you do, I only have one favor asking you, and that is, be a mensch. That means be a human being. I just completed my memoirs, and I named the book Be a Mensch, a Holocaust legacy of a father to his son. I was now alone. Moshe Heller was gone, my father was gone, my mother, my sister had been shot in 1942, my younger brother, who was in Yaslo there, was shot in the middle of 1943, or around February 1943. I wasn't sure of the date. And my little brother, Henrik, was, during the liquidation of the ghetto in Rzeszów, sent also to Auschwitz with my cousin David and his little boy Michael, and they perished there. So now I was the only survivor of the family, and I was in Kraków, Płaszów. Summer came. The Soviets were moving closer and closer to Krakow, forcing the German armies back westward. It was then that they started liquidating the camp, and almost weekly transports of people were shipped out of our camp into different areas. Also, there were a few mass graves from previous shootings in Kraków, Płaszów, and we were ordered to open these mass graves and burn the corpses so as not to leave any trace of the atrocities that had been committed there. I was taken out of the glazier and painter shop and assigned to those mass graves. As I was there in the mass grave, I was trying to move a corpse, and I remember that corpse very well. It was a redhead individual, because even now when I see a redhead, I always think of that corpse. There was a baby lying next to him, and I wanted to be very gentle as not to injure this corpse. And as I was bending down to gently lift this corpse up with my shovel, a German criminal capo who had been sent from Auschwitz to Kraków, Płaszów to be a capo over the Jewish prisoners there, all of a sudden kicked me with his boot into my face. His boot was loaded with decomposed matter from the corpses, because he was walking on those corpses. And I had this decomposed matter in my eyes, in my nose, in my mouth, and I was bleeding from the nose. I found out long after the war that I had a broken nose, that I couldn't figure out when it could have happened. And of course, it must have happened when he had kicked me in the nose. Anyway, I also there in that mass grave found a golden tooth lying around. So while the capo did not look, I grabbed that golden tooth and put it in my pocket. I thought, why should they get it? I later gave it to a goldsmith in the camp. to whatever he was going to do with it. I felt guilty having taken it as I was in the Krosno ghetto when I was assigned to clean up after the people who were sent for extermination to Belzerts, and I happened to be cleaning in our Dr. Baumring's apartment, and as I was moving the clothes out to pile them up in a pile, as ordered, I saw a gold earring. As Becker, the Gestapo man, was looking the other way, I stuck that gold ring into my pocket. And when I came back to the ghetto, my mother and my sister were still alive, I gave that gold ring to my sister. And I again felt guilty. But when you consider that if I had not taken it, the Germans would have gotten it, so why should I feel guilty about it? Anyway, after this assignment at the mass grave, October 15th, during the appel in the morning, I was called out and assigned to a group that was going to go to Schindler's Camp in Brünnlitz, which was a small town in Sudetenland, which was Germany at the time. Of course, I was glad to go to Schindler's Camp because he was known in the concentration camp as a good man who was saving Jews in his Emaria plant in Krakow. We were sent in cattle cars to Gross Rosen. Gross Rosen was a concentration camp in Germany, a horrible one, and that we were sent there, and from there we were supposed to go to Schindler's Camp in Sudetenland. I could peek out through in between the boards of the train as the train was rushing by, and I could tell when it crossed the Polish-German border by the appearance of the train stations. The train stations on the German side were neat and clean, whereas the stations on the Polish side were poor, in disrepair. Anyway, we arrived in Gross Rosen. There, the SS was waiting for us and marched us up the hill into the camp. Now, mind you, that was October 15th, 1944. As we got up there, we were lined up, told to undress naked, and then we were standing naked. A faint snow was falling. It was freezing cold. So we bunched together to keep warm. I had the $20 gold coin. Now I was afraid because we were waiting to go into the showers, and rumors had it that the prisoners are being examined, including their orifices are examined for hiding some valuables. So while it was getting dark, I dropped that gold coin on the ground. We were then sent into the showers. First, we had to go through a hair-cutting affair. Now, there were some prisoners sitting on little stools, and we were lined up, and the prisoner who was handling my row didn't say a word. He just hit you in the back of the head to kneel down in front of him, and there he made a vertical pass over your head, so you were shorn all the way to the scalp, and the rest of the hair was shorn short. Then we went through a row where 2 prisoners stood on each side with a bucket of disinfectant, and they had a pole with some rags at the end. They dipped it in that disinfectant, and we had to keep our arms apart, and they smeared it in our armpits, and then we had to bend over where they smeared it in the rectum and the genitals. And we continued into the showers. I was hoping that the showers are not going to be releasing gas, but water. And indeed, I was pleasantly surprised when we entered the showers and water started running. We took the shower. After the shower, we were sent into a barrack where we had to sit down on our rears on the floor, spread our thighs as wide as we could, and the next prisoner was supposed to be forced into the prisoner before him. Well, I can only tell you it was a mess. The assessman stood there with a whip, and he was whipping you to force you into the other guy's crotch. Well, I thought that I will have no testicles left. They will be smashed. And it was horrible. And there we were sitting like this for many hours. You couldn't stand up, you couldn't move. Finally, they had us stand up and then go through a row where they had a pile of shirts, another pile of shoes, and another pile of striped uniforms. Well, with the whip moving us rapidly, we grabbed whatever we could, a shirt, and I happened to get a nightgown which reached to my feet, probably from a victim, some Jewish victim that they had there. The shoes, you couldn't select shoes, so you just grabbed 2 shoes, whether they were 2 right shoes or left shoes or not, and later exchanged it with other prisoners to fit. And of course, the striped outfit. And we were sent to the barrack. I developed massive diarrhea there. There wasn't a shred of paper to be seen anywhere there. The place was so clean, there was nothing there to wipe yourself with. So that nightgown came in handy, because I tore off strips of it until it reached to my hips, and used it for toilet paper. We were fortunately there only a few days. following which we were shipped to a Schindler's camp in Sudetenland. On the way down to the train station, they gave us a can of condensed milk, which I had never seen, never tasted. And it was something delicious. And of course, we got a ration of bread. We were loaded on cattle trains, and we were shipped to Schindler's camp. As we entered Schindler's camp, we were assigned to bunks, which were set up in the machinery room there. And there was already a contingent, a small contingent of mechanics who were setting up the presses, the machines. I was assigned again to the glaziers. Fortunately, the glazier shop was in a far corner of the camp, had no window, had metal doors, and was relatively isolated. So it was a nice place to hide. And nobody ever came in there. So I was there, and a gentleman by the name of Miller, who had been a barrack elder in Krakow. As we got in there, there was a hole in the wall high up. And he lifted me up, and I peeked through that hole into a hall where that was a textile factory. And Czechs were working there. They saw me peek through that hole. And the following day, there was a piece of bread in that hole. And from that time on, every so often, there was a piece of bread, occasionally even a piece of bacon, and occasionally a few potatoes. So we had extra rations, because the ration we got there initially consisted of a sixth of a small loaf of bread in the morning, with some so-called coffee, which was brown water from ersatz, roasted grains of some sort. The sixth of a small loaf of bread, I thought, was for breakfast. So I ate it, only to find out that that was supposed to be for the entire day. At lunch, we got some beet water, supposedly beet soup, but you could barely see a few pieces of beet in there. For supper, again beet soup. And so day after day, I finally urinated maroon every day from the beet water. On a rare occasion, I happened to catch a piece of horse meat. The guys who were ladling out the soup, the cooks, had their own favorite prisoners to whom they gave from the bottom. So they got beets. I got the water, since I didn't know any of these people. To make a long story short, after a while, our ration was increased to originally we got 1/8 of a small loaf. So the ration was increased to 1/6 of a small loaf. And on occasions, we got a quarter of a loaf. Now, this was thanks to Mrs. Schindler, Emily, who had a friend there who owned a flour mill, Countess Daubeck. And she finagled with that Countess Daubeck to get extra flour so that we can get a larger ration of bread. So the diet improved a little bit. And we were there until about December of 1944, when we were assigned to dig tank, what do you call it? Tank ditches, because the Soviets were coming closer and closer to that camp. Now, the young SS guards were taken away and shipped to the front. And they sent us some ulsters from the Volkssturm. So ulsters who were mobilized, and they were relatively harmless. As a matter of fact, that ulster was sitting there with his carabin while we were digging these ditches to keep the tanks from passing. And he was peeling himself an apple, and he gave me a little piece of his apple. At around that time, a fellow by the name of Gross, whose wife had hailed from Krosno, and he himself, during the ghetto time, was in Krosno, and he was with us at the air base, came over one day to the Glacier shop to talk to me. What he was telling me was that he is organizing a resistance group because they have heard that Obersturmführer Leipold, who was the Gestapo chief, the SS chief of the camp, intended to execute us before he would let us free when the war ends. The war was coming to an end. And he asked me whether I would want to participate. We would then escape from the camp into the surrounding forests. And there were plenty of Sudeten forests around there. And I told him, oh, definitely. Also, when we were in that glacier shop, in order to thank the Czechs for the few provisions that they gave us, we made little photo stands out of glass. And Mr. Gross, who was an engineer, a mechanical engineer, was making for me from a triangular file a drill to drill holes in the glass. We used a stone to bevel the glass, and he made me that drill to drill holes and little side pieces, and I made those stands, and I put it in the wall in that hole for the Czechs to take as a thank you for the help that they gave us. When I got a potato, I would call Mr. Gross and the two girls from my hometown who were there with me, Frida and Sonia. They both had worked for Schindler in Krakow originally, and Frida had been with my brother in Jasło when he was killed, and she was the one who divulged to me long after the war what happened to him. I would take the potato and I would cut it into 4 pieces, and we shared it. Those girls still remember today, they're still alive, how I shared with them the food that I got from the Czechs. In January, as the Soviets were coming closer, we were called by Mr. Schindler to assemble in the hall there, where he gave us a speech. The SS men were there too, but they're all Ulsters. And there was also Leipold, the chief assessment there. And what he did is he told us that the war is coming to an end, and he is sorry for everything that we have suffered, that they have suffered as well, and he pleaded with us not to try to take a revenge on the guards. They suffered as well as we did and all that sort of stuff. And then a few days or a few weeks later, he packed up to leave. He offered those prisoners that wanted to go with him westward. The Germans were scared to death to be taken by the Soviets. So they all wanted to go westward to be taken by the Americans. So a number of people volunteered to go with him. They were put on trucks, and he, as well as those guys, left. Obersturmführer Leipold left. The guards left, except for a couple that remained, but they were nice guards. They didn't harm anybody, and we decided to protect them should the Soviets come in, which we did. Then, one morning, as they were all gone, and we were relatively free within the camp, but we wouldn't dare leave the camp, some of the prisoners made a red flag to greet the oncoming Soviet soldiers if they should come into the camp. And one day there was a company of olive-dressed military around the camp. So they ran out with the red flag thinking that these were Soviets. All of a sudden, shots came towards us, machine guns. Well, these were actually Vlasov army soldiers escaping from the east westward to the Americans. And they shot at us. I dropped on the ground, nobody was hit, and they went off. I forgot to mention that a few weeks earlier, trainloads of Jewish prisoners were seen around our camp, because around the perimeter was the railroad. They were emaciated, they were dying, and the SS guards didn't know what to do with them. So they came into our camp and they asked Mr. Schindler whether he could take them. Mrs. Schindler and Mr. Schindler then organized a rescue effort. What we did in the machine room, we put up straw on the ground, on the floors, including in our glazing shop, and we brought all these wretched, dying prisoners, frozen, into our camp and tried to revive them. They died every day because they were beyond revival, most of them. Some of them, when you lifted them, the skin came off them. It was a horrible sight. Anyway, one day when they were, all the assessment were gone, Schindler was gone with the few people that left with him, a young Soviet soldier on a horse rode into the camp. Some of the prisoners who knew Russian talked to him and told him who we were. He left, and that afternoon a Soviet, I assume general, I didn't know their ranks, came into the camp and gave us a speech. The speech was that we ought to thank Comrade Stalin for our liberation. And he left. We were now free. As we got free, the prisoners took that capo, that criminal capo who had kicked me, because he was a horrible man and supposedly was beating and maltreating prisoners when he was in Auschwitz or wherever he was before, and they hung him. Now, I was there, but I couldn't watch hanging anybody, and I did not think that it was right to do that, just because they did that to us. I walked out. I didn't want to watch it. Anyway, we were now free. Some of the prisoners went outside the camp and ransacked German homes, took clothing and everything else. As I was following them, I didn't think that was right. I didn't take a thing, not a thing. I didn't want to take part in it because I did not know whom they were ransacking. Maybe this happened to be a good German. So I did not do that. But they also got some pigs from German farmers, and they made a delicious soup and meat, and for the first time I got a decent meal in the camp. Also, when the SS were withdrawing, they were loading all kinds of materials for uniforms, for Hitler Youth as well as for SS uniforms. They loaded it into the camp. So the prisoners then took this material and gave everybody some material for a suit. So I got material, black material for a suit. I got a Hitler Youth blouse and a Hitler Youth cap. I took my striped suit and I threw it away. I didn't want any part of it. Some people took the striped suit with them, but I didn't want any part of that. And after a few days like that, free, I decided to try to go back to Poland, back to my hometown, to see who had survived there. The going was difficult. I had some bread with me and water. I went to the train station, boarded the train, and the train stopped at a river because the bridge was destroyed by bombing. So we had to wait for a boat to take us across at the river. On the other side, there was a train waiting, a cattle train. So there was no space because it was loaded with prisoners that were now freed and going back home to Poland. So I and a number of people climbed up the roof and we sat on the roof. The train started moving. As it was coming close to a tunnel, we would lie flat, prone on our bellies so as not to get our heads chopped off. And so we finally got to Prague. In Prague at the station, there was a Red Cross kettle with soup, with Red Cross people dishing out soup for the refugees. And I ate a delicious hot soup. I've been very thankful to the Red Cross ever since, and I always donate money to them. Well, we went through the border of Czechoslovakia and Poland, and there at the border, a Russian and a Polish border guard tried to confiscate the material I had for the suit. And I had to plead with them, telling them and showing them a certificate I had from the camp, which was given to me after liberation, asking authorities to ease our trip back home. I pleaded with them, and they let me have my material. I then came to Krakow. In Krakow, I inquired whether there was a Jewish community there, and I found that indeed there was one, and I went there. There I was provided with food, I was registered, and I was telling them that I'm going to my hometown in Krosno. They advised me not to go back to my hometown, but to stay in Krakow, because some Jews were being killed by some rightist Polish underground people. Well, I told them that I can't see anyone wanted to kill me. I haven't harmed anybody. I have done nothing to anybody, and I am going regardless. So I boarded again a freight train and went to my hometown. Well, the hometown railroad station was bumped out. So the train stopped in a village a number of miles before Krosno. The village's name was Menchinka, which I knew that village very well because there was the electricity plant which supplied electricity to our town. And I remember having glazed there with my father in the winter. That's where he got his fingers frozen. And the putty would freeze in our hands. We had to continue rubbing it to keep it from freezing and hardening. Anyway, I got off in Menchinka, got on the road, and then asked a peasant who was going to Krosno to give me a lift, which he did. I arrived in Krosno. There, I went straight to the custodian of that building which we owned. He was a drunk. Anyway, I asked him, are there any Jews around in town? So he showed me to a family by the name of Kaub. It was a mother and a daughter, and a brother-in-law there with his daughter. They survived, Mrs. Kaub and her daughter survived being hidden by a peasant, and her brother-in-law had survived on false Aryan papers. The child was hidden by Poles. They were lucky because they originally came from a village, and in that village they knew every peasant, and those peasants saved them. I went there, and that lady, the most wonderful lady, allowed me to stay in her kitchen where I was sleeping. She was cooking. She made a living from selling cigarettes. She had been there since August because our town, Krosno, was liberated by the Soviets in August of 1944, when I was still in Kraków-Płaszów. Anyway, she was telling me all kinds of stories, how she survived, which is a very long story, and I will not give it to you here. It's a very long story. Her daughter had been signed up in the school there, and she was telling me how she suffered indignities, anti-Semitic remarks by Polish kids. Anyway, they were hoping to go back westward and eventually go to Palestine. There was no Israel yet. I was only there a few weeks. I was supposed to register when I returned because I was of the military age. But I did not register because I was afraid I'll be put into the army and I'll have to stay in Poland. And it wasn't my intention to stay there. About a week later, my father's brother, who was liberated in Buchenwald by General Patton's army, all of a sudden showed up with all kinds of goodies from the West that he got from the Jewish organization and the UNRWA. He had American cigarettes, he had all kinds of cans with good food, chocolate, salami, something that we didn't see in the East. And he told me, we are all going back to the West. There is no place for any Jew here. In the West, there are all kinds of Jewish organizations, and we will all go back. I'm going to stop right here.